general recording failure come up.
I've got stop recording right now, 2 gigabytes remaining. So it looks like it's recording.
Well, we might have to have you guys back. I don't know. I think it's recording.
Yeah, I started it, and it changed from start recording to stop recording. So that's
then you got it. Thank you very much. Gregory, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for bearing with us. Good evening and welcome to today's debate hosted by the International Medical Council on Vaccination. I'm your moderator, Gregory Escobar. This evening we're honored to have Dr. Jay Wile and Dr. Boyd Haley joining us to debate the question, do vaccines cause autism? Dr. Jay Wile earned his Bachelor in Science degree in Chemistry from the University of Rochester and a PhD in Nuclear Chemistry from the same institution. He has won several awards for excellence in teaching and presented numerous lectures on the topics of nuclear chemistry, Christian apologetics, homeschooling, and creation versus evolution. He has been published in nationally recognized journals and has authored or co-authored 8 award-winning science textbooks designed to be used in a homeschool setting. He has taught at the institutions that include the University of Rochester, Indiana University, Ball State University, and the Indiana Academy for Science, Mathematics, and Humanities. Dr. Boyd Haley earned his BA in Chemistry Physics from Franklin College in 1963. After a tour with the U.S. Army as a medic, he completed his Master of Science degree in Chemistry at the University of Idaho in 1966 and earned his PhD in Chemistry Biochemistry at Washington State University in 1971. He was an NIH postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Physiology at the Yale University Medical School from 1971 to 1974. His first academic appointment was at the University of Wyoming in 1974, with promotion to full professor in 1983. In 1985, he was appointed as the first scientist at the Markey Cancer Center at the University of Kentucky, with an academic appointment as professor in the College of Pharmacy and the Department of Biochemistry of the University of Kentucky Medical Center. In 1996, Dr. Haley was named professor and chairman of the Department of Chemistry, a position he held for the next 8 years. He was also co-founder and scientific advisor of Affinity Labeling Technologies Incorporated, a biotechnology company that synthesizes and markets to major research institutes nucleotide photoaffinity analogs for biomedical research. Today, Dr. Haley will be arguing on the affirmative that vaccines do cause autism, and Dr. Wile will be arguing on the negative that vaccines do not cause autism. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for opening arguments to present their case. Following the opening arguments, each speaker will have 8 minutes for a rebuttal speech to respond to the opposing arguments. In the rebuttal speeches, the speaker will also be open for questions from the other debater. Finally, each speaker will have 5 minutes for closing remarks. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Boyd Haley for his opening arguments. Dr. Haley?
Okay, Dr. Haley, you're getting the prompt?
I have, but I have no...
We're seeing your email.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now that's gone, and I have no...
It's down there at the bottom. Click on the other one. The one there.
Okay, I'm here. Can you see that now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, all right. Now we're off, I guess. Right. You know, the thing that we have to understand about autism is it's a modern man-initiated disease. The first cases, general cases, widespread cases of autism were described in the early 40s by Dr. Leo Kanner, the psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins University. He had a group of 8 or 9-year-olds, which he described as the first of the kind that he had ever observed, and he was a rather elderly person at that time. And I would point out that no one knew what caused autism at that time, and they thought it was some sort of genetic disorder, and it was considered that for many years. But I would point out that this occurred, these children started occurring at the ages of 8 to 9, for up to 8 to 10 years after the introduction of thimerosal-type compounds were introduced into biology as an antimicrobial. The autism remained relatively rare for many centuries as a neurological disease. The rate was around well below 4 per 10,000 until the late 1980s. Then in the early 1990s, a dramatic increase in autism began to be reported, which was continued up through at least 2003, with the current rate of near 1 per 100 children. I don't want to quibble about the exact rate. The rate was 4 to 5 times higher in males than females. This increase started with the introduction of the CDC mandated vaccine program in about 1988 and 1990. That is one key thing that people have to keep in mind. Today, the autism rate is much higher in the USA than it is in other modern countries that keep records. These countries have never vaccinated as early nor as often as the United States, and some have removed thimerosal from their infant vaccines back as early as 1992. So what caused the autism epidemic? There are certain things that we can eliminate. We have spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to try and find a genetic cause. We have identified many genetic susceptibilities that might be involved, but they don't account for even a small percentage of the autistic children. It is also scientifically impossible for genetics to cause an epidemic. It can be a genetic susceptibility to an environmental toxin. That is totally possible. However, the toxin exposure had to increase in all 50 states at approximately the same time, around 1980 to 1999, and it had to expose all children under the age of 3, because that's about when they're diagnosed. Now, when you look at this, whatever caused this epidemic occurred in Alaska, Hawaii, California, Florida, Maine, Nebraska, and all the states in between. And that eliminates a lot of toxins such as coal-fired power plants, etc., as being the major contributor. The toxins must affect infants more than adolescents. And when we look at that, why we say that? Well, infants get autism. You don't see a sickness, any type of neurological disease, showing up in children after 7 or 8 years of age. And what we do know is that the thimerosal is exceptionally more toxic to infants than it is to adolescents. We'll talk about that in detail later. The gender effect. The toxin has to affect boys much more than girls. Only Mercury is known to do this. It is well known that rats, mixed gender rats in a cage exposed to thimerosal, that all the males will be dead before the first female shows any sign of suffering. Again, any suggestion toxin has to explain the multiple cellular and biochemical abnormalities observed clinically in autistic children. The multiple sites of thimerosal and aluminum mixed toxicity does this best. Only multiple toxins exposed to infants from the CDC mandated vaccine program fulfill the above criteria to be generally considered as possibly causal for autism. Now, people say that's, doesn't make sense, and that's kind of off the cuff. But what we have to look at is the U.S. child mortality rate. Of 42 countries that keep records, the United States now ranks 42 globally, behind much of Europe as well as the United Arab Emirates, Cuba, and Chile. In other words, we have the highest infant mortality rate in the world. 20 years ago, we were 29th, and much before that, we were number 1. I mean, our children lived longer than anyone. So we have to say, what took us from being a country that produced some of the healthiest children to one that now, in comparison, produces the most ill children? For example, Singapore has a mortality rate of 2.5 deaths per thousand. The USA rate is 6.7 per 1,000. The high rate exists among higher income white groups, and this is a group that has traditionally had the best access to medical care. So it's not the poor in the United States that's developing autism or infant mortality. It is the wealthy as well. These observations implicate increased vaccination or increased medical care as a possible toxic contributor to infant illness. The references on the bottom here was by Norman Levy in the Chicago Tribune, May of this year. If we look at this table and we look at the infant mortality rate, we can see, and this was, again, the references there from the United Nations Demographic Yearbook of 2007. The United States, again, is shown to have one of the highest infant mortality rates in 2004, 5, and 6. We look at these numbers and we say, if these children are sick, these children are dying at a higher rate, why would we be surprised that they would also have a higher rate of neurological illness? Keeping in mind that the Center for Disease Control has released data saying that 1 out of 6 American children has a neurodevelopmental disorder. And I think it's hard to explain based on any other factor, why Hong Kong, Japan, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and the Czech Republic would have such a much better childhood survival rate than the United States. If we look at child deaths in the developed world, again on the next slide, we see that the United States is somewhere in between, dramatically below a lot of countries that definitely don't have the effective medical care, etc., that we should be having. The child death rates in the year 1 to 4, these are children, not infants. We see again, we rank up there quite high, much higher than we should be, much higher than several of the other countries that exist there. And in different states, this rate is even markedly higher. So the infant mortality rate in the United States is such that if we had the death rate that existed in Hong Kong or Singapore, that there would be 18,000 more children live in the United States today than live with our current death rate. And the calculations is shown there. Because the average lowest 4 countries was about 2.5, ours is 6.7, so that's 4.2 per thousand, and there were 4 million live births that year. If you divide that out, that means that we're losing a lot of infants. And if you believe in the right to life, which I know many of you do, I think that none of us would disagree that a child that's born in the United States has a right to survival and a right to live, and if he does live, he should live a healthy life. The argument here is, if we have this many children dying, why would we be surprised that we would have an elevated autism rate? Well, we can say that we have a very high rate of infants being vaccinated. And I think there were 36 vaccines in the first 6 months, whereas the next highest country was Britain with roughly half that level. The rest of Europe and the modern world has about 1/4 that rate. So we have a real problem here, that we have the highest vaccine. And I think what we can say is that we can ask the question, if vaccines decrease the rate of childhood death due to infectious diseases such as whooping cough, measles, etc., what type of death is occurring that makes the U.S. place number 41 on this list? And I think what we're seeing is that we have an increase in asthma and an increase in autism spectrum disorders, and I think these are items that lead to our increased childhood death. If we look at the rate of autism in relationship to receiving hepatitis B vaccine, this is a vaccine which one has to really question the sanity of giving this on the day of birth. You get hepatitis B by having sex with an infected person or using a dirty drug needle. So we'd have to ask, why would the CDC recommend that you give this to children on the day of birth in the hospital and expose them to increased amounts of thimerosal at this time? Autism in relationship to receiving hepatitis B. There's no CDC data on the autism rate after thimerosal removal. We don't know that. We know that in 2008, boys that were vaccinated with 3 Hep B vaccines during the time when vaccines were manufactured with thimerosal were statistically more susceptible to developmental disability than unvaccinated boys. That's published in Toxicology and Environmental Chemistry. In 2009, children who received hepatitis B vaccine series were 50 to 74% more likely to develop a central nervous system inflammatory demyelinization, which is found in autism, and children who did not receive the vaccine, depending upon the vaccine manufacturer. In 2010, boys vaccinated with hepatitis B as neonates had a 3-fold greater odds for autism compared to boys never vaccinated or vaccinated after the first month of life. In 2009, infant male primates who received 1 dose of hepatitis B vaccine were far more likely to display developmental delays than unvaccinated control. I think the basic research into looking at children and items like that put a heavy load on the vaccine being directly involved. Now, does this make sense? This is a publication that occurred back in 1977. It came out of Toronto, Canada. And they were using a material called merthiolate. Merthiolate had as its active ingredient thimerosal. In this hospital, they were treating children with infected umbilical cords, and they used merthiolate to paint the stomach area where near the umbilical cord to prevent infections. And what they found, of the 13 children so treated, 10 died. Now, please understand that merthiolate was commonly used by every farm kid in the United States. Every kid that got a scratch, his mother would paint him with this merthiolate. It was a pink material. And none of these children, or at least there was no noted incidents of them dying. So what this tells us is that infants who do not make bile cannot excrete mercury. The mercury builds up in their body, and infants are tremendously more sensitive to the toxicity of thimerosal than are adolescents. So there is a reason to believe from this inadvertent study that thimerosal would be very, very toxic if given to infants on the day of birth. And this is exactly what happened. It's the big mistake. Someone at the CDC or some group at the CDC and FDA decided it was okay to inject thimerosal into newborns at levels that would be EPA safe based on eating fish if the infant weighed 275 pounds. I put this down to point out to you that these children were given what would be considered tremendously toxic levels of mercury by the Environmental Protection Agency. Also understand this safe level was based on eating fish and whale meat, and 2/3 of our heavy metal protection is in our intestine. Once you vaccinate and inject this organic material in the skin, in the muscle, it bypasses this protection that we have, the biggest area of protection, and makes it even more toxic. So if ingesting mercury is toxic, then it stands to reason that injecting thimerosal is equally more toxic, or more toxic. There's this other publication with hepatitis B vaccination in male neonates and autism, and they just made, again, the claim, and this was from a very good university. It said boys received the hepatitis B vaccine during the first month of life had a 2.94 greater odds for autism spectrum disorders compared to unvaccinated boys. Non-Hispanic white boys were 6. So the conclusion was that the U.S. male neonates vaccinated with hepatitis B had a 3-fold greater risk of things. And if they delayed the DPT vaccine, they reduced the incidence of childhood asthma. This was another study published again in a good refereed journal from a good research university. If we look at the synergistic toxicities of neurons in culture, and we look at the neurons live for 24 hours with a very slight death rate. If we put in 50 nanomolar, and understand the vaccines contained 125,000 nanomolar, but if you put that in, you could see that the neurons die at a consistent rate. However, if you mix with that with aluminum, they die at a much, much more rapid rate. That's the red arrows. You see that the aluminum alone is not very toxic, but the two together. But the most important thing is if you added estrogen, you would protect against this death. You could actually reverse the killing by the thimerosal. However, if we put in testosterone, the male hormone, the neurons were all dead within 3 hours. So we have backup on this. Other people have done this on rats, showing that estradiol reduces cumulative mercury uptake by the brain and the damage that it causes. This research most likely shows why boys retain mercury more than girls and why boys are more likely to be autistic. And this puts points a very stark finger at the thimerosal and the vaccines as the causal agent for this illness. Is my time up?
It's about up.
Okay, well, this is the last thing I want to talk about, and that is their boy crisis. We have found out at the same time that the autism rate was going up in the United States, the boys were losing their academic ability. And this boy crisis, this is from the Lexington Herald Leader, and what it basically says is that as boys age, they lose they've lost the academic ability that they used to have. There was about 20 years ago that boys were better in science and math on the average than young girls, and that has flip-flopped. And in the academic world, we know that it's not because the girls have gotten markedly better. They haven't. In the United States, the girls have actually dropped in their comparison to other countries, but the boys have dropped even more. And I think at this point, we can say that this gender selectivity of thimerosal is very likely the causation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haley. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jay Wile for his opening arguments for 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are seeing the screen.
Good. Now, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and present the science that clearly shows that vaccines have nothing to do with autism. I think the thing I need to start out with is understanding how medically we determine whether one thing causes another. We can't do that based on individual stories or gross statistics. We have to do studies because there are a wealth of factors that determine whether or not someone is healthy. And if I want to focus in on one factor, I have to control for all the others. The only way I can do that is with a study. So if I want to determine whether or not X causes Y, I have to do some studies. Now, there are many different methodologies for medical studies, and the idea is the more methodologies we use, the more different methodologies we use, and the more populations we test, the better we can be confident of our result. But there's one other thing we have to realize when we're studying people. There's a lot of natural variation among people. In the end, if I study a group of people, my study could be wrong, not because I made any mistakes, but because the group of people that I've studied aren't representative of the true population. Now, it turns out statistics tell us how to gauge the error associated with a study like that. All you do is take the square root of the number of people you study, divide by that number, and multiply by 100. That gives you an idea of the error in your study. So let's suppose I study 100 people. If I study 100 people, my error is 10%. What that means is, even if my study was perfect, I still have a 10% chance of being wrong because that's the nature of studying people. If I want to be more confident of my results, I have to study more people. If I studied 10,000 people, that same equation tells me my error is 1%. So there's only a 1% chance I'm wrong. So in the end, not only do we need studies with different methodologies and different populations, we need to study large numbers of people. With that said, let's look at a few studies that talk about vaccines and autism. Now, there have been a wealth of studies that show that vaccines have no relation to autism. They just took my presenter away.
We just lost your slide.
Okay, is it back now?
It is now back.
Okay. There are a wealth of studies that show that vaccines aren't related to autism, so I'm going to have to focus my discussion on just the question of whether the thimerosal in some vaccines causes autism. There have been a lot of studies on that, and the studies all show that it doesn't. For example, this study was done in 2003. Notice some of the authors are highlighted in blue. That's important, and I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. But anyway, this was what's called a retrospective cohort study, which means we looked at a group of people, but we didn't actually study the people, we studied their medical records. In phase 1 of the study, they studied more than 120,000 children, which produces an error rate of less than 0.5%. In the second phase, they studied a smaller group that had a higher error rate, but it was still under 1%. It uses vaccination records to determine the thimerosal exposure for each person, and then it looked at several neurological outcomes, including autism. So, if thimerosal in vaccines caused autism, you should see the more thimerosal the child got, the more risk he had of being autistic. However, that's not what the study showed. The study showed that for all levels of thimerosal exposure, the risk of autism was the same. This says that autism is not related to thimerosal. Now, this study did find a couple of neurological outcomes that did depend on thimerosal. Increased thimerosal exposure resulted in a slight increase in risk of tics and language delays. They did phase 2 of the study to see if they could repeat the results. They could not repeat the results for tics and language delays, but they could for autism. So in both phases of the study, there was no relationship between thimerosal and autism. Now, moving on to another study, one highlighted author here, that's important. This study was published just this year.
Hey, Nick.
We can hear you, Susan. We can hear you. You're talking over me. In this particular study, this is a case-controlled study. A case-controlled study is different from a cohort study. In this case, we looked at a group of autistic kids, and then for each autistic kid, we tried to match the kid.
Hi.
We can still hear you, Suzanne.
We can still hear
yes.
you.
Please mute yourself, Suzanne.
Hearing what?
We're hearing you.
Hold on. I'm muted.
We can hear you.
After a while.
Oh, I didn't say anything. I'm sitting here alone.
All right.
Yeah, but we can hear you nevertheless.
Is your mic muted, Suzanne?
Okay.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, Dr. Ora.
A case-controlled study, we look at a group of autistic kids, and for each kid we try to match them closely with up to 3 non-autistic kids. So in this case, we're looking at autistic kids and we're comparing them to a closely matched group of non-autistic kids. Now the numbers in this study are not nearly as good, only 256 autistic and 752 non-autistic. That's higher error, but it's still under 10%, which isn't bad. The reason the numbers are lower is rather than look at medical records, they actually looked at the individual kids. They assessed all kids. All children were confirmed with the Autism Diagnostic Observance Schedule. In the end, the level of thimerosal was calculated from the vaccines again, and once again, the level of thimerosal exposure was not related to whether or not the child was autistic. If thimerosal was related to autism, you should see higher levels of thimerosal in the autistic group. You did not. So once again, thimerosal and autism aren't related. Let's look at one other study, which is yet another type of study, a different methodology entirely. 3 highlighted authors here. That's important too. We'll talk about highlighted authors in a minute. This is a direct cohort study where we directly analyze individuals. Now, in this study, the CDC really tried to bend over backwards to people who believe that vaccines cause autism. They had an independent board of advisors, and that board had on it people who thought vaccines cause autism. So they tried really hard to take all the considerations of these folks into account. The vaccines who cause autism crowd really helped design this study. So instead of just looking at at whether or not a child had autism, they actually measured 42 different neurological outcomes that are all affected by autism. They also interviewed the mothers and gave the mothers an IQ test. They studied more than 1,000 kids, so the error rate's fairly low, 3%. Level of thimerosal was calculated not only from vaccination schedules, but also from interviews with the mother. And in the result of the 42 assessments, the thimerosal-exposed kids actually did better on 12 of the assessments than the non-exposed kids. They did slightly worse on 8 of the assessments, and 22 of the assessments had no effect. So in the end, what small effect thimerosal has is on balance positive neurologically, according to this study. And once again, this study was people who helped design this study believed that vaccines cause autism. Interestingly enough, one of those people, Sally Bernard, who is of Safe Minds, was involved in every step of the study until the results became clear. At that point, she decided to quit. Now, I want to talk about these highlighted authors because that's pretty important. These highlighted authors are important because they have a proven track record of finding a problem with a vaccine and publishing it. In 1999, the rotavirus vaccine was licensed for use by the FDA, and the CDC put it on the standard vaccination schedule. In less than a year, it became apparent that there was a problem with that vaccine, so a study was done, and the authors I've highlighted so far were on that study. That study showed clearly that for 1 out of every 11,073 children, there was a severe bowel obstruction caused by the rotavirus vaccine. Now that's a tiny side effect, 1 in every 11,000, but it was still enough to get the vaccine pulled from the vaccination schedule. This cost the pharmaceutical company hundreds of millions of dollars, and it embarrassed both the FDA and the CDC. Nevertheless, these authors did the study, found the problem, and published it regardless of the consequences to the pharma companies and to the CDC and FDA. So these folks have a proven track record on finding a problem with a vaccine. If anyone's going to find a problem with a vaccine, it's going to be them, and they can't find a relationship between autism and thimerosal. The other thing to note here is this 1 out of every 11,000. That's how sensitive these studies are. These studies can find a side effect even if it occurs only once in every 11,000 kids. So this shows that thimerosal can't be related to autism even at a rate of 1 out of 11,000. All right? Now let's move on to a couple of other studies. This one is a reuse of one of the methods we've used before, but it's nice. It comes from Canada, so it's nice to see a different country in the studies. This is a retrospective cohort study again, followed 27,000 plus infants. They looked at all pervasive development diseases, including autism. They received a diagnosis from the special needs teacher at the school. They used immunization records to calculate thimerosal exposure. Many of the kids had no thimerosal exposure, depending on when they were born. Some had up to 225 micrograms. Here's the interesting thing. The raw data showed that the thimerosal-free children had a higher incidence of autism than the thimerosal-exposed children. For those who weren't exposed to thimerosal, the autism rate was 82.7 out of 10,000. For those who were exposed to thimerosal, it was 59.5 out of 10,000. This is impossible to understand if thimerosal is related to autism. Now, does this mean thimerosal protects against autism? No. Remember, there are lots of factors that go in to determine whether a person is healthy. When I take all those other factors into account, which we call confounding factors, we find there's no relationship between thimerosal and autism rate. But the raw data showed, if nothing else, the thimerosal-free children had a higher level of autism. This is the last study I want to talk about, completely different methodology. It's a populational study. It shows autism rates for different years as reported to California's Department of Developmental Services. Each line represents a different age. It goes from 1989 to 2003. The important thing here is that in 1999, the Institute of Medicine decided that for public relations reasons, we should remove thimerosal from vaccines. It was accomplished by 2001 for all childhood vaccines except the flu vaccine. Only trace amounts of thimerosal now exist. And so, during the phase-out period between the blue and the red line, thimerosal exposure for Californians was going down. After 2001, it was significantly lower, but notice the autism rates continued to rise. And in fact, this study only goes out to 2003. California's Department of Developmental Services just recently released numbers that go out to 2007, and you see exactly the same effect. All the way out to 2007, the number of autism cases per year is independent of the phase-out of thimerosal in vaccines. The exposure of thimerosal dropped off remarkably after 2001, but the rates of autism continue to rise. So really, we see that there's no relationship between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism. These studies use multiple methodologies. They have very low error rates because they include high numbers of people. One of the studies used an outside panel of advisors, including one of the big voices in the vaccines cause autism crowd. And 3 of the studies I talked about were done by investigators who already have a proven track record of finding a rare problem with the vaccine and getting it pulled from the vaccination schedule as a result. This gives you high level of confidence that the science behind this is well known, and thimerosal is not related to vaccines in any way, shape, manner, or form. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wile. We're moving into the rebuttal speeches. So, Dr. Haley, you have 8 minutes to refute.
Okay. I'm going to skip down here a couple of slides which show the biochemistry that indicates that the problems you see in autistic children are problems that could be induced by mercury. They are definitely the biomedical issues that exist with these children are those that could be induced by very, very low levels of mercury. And then we'll talk about the epidemiological studies. No agency of the U.S. government has ever commissioned a significant epidemiological study, in spite of what Dr. Wile says, that is done independently by any major American university. The individuals that he talked about and that he mentions that were involved in all these studies were also people that are associated with the CDC and were involved in what is called the Verstraeten studies and the studies done in Denmark. Most of the studies that have been done early on, especially, have been done by foreign researchers, most on foreign subjects, and funded by the CDC. Some of these individual researchers, some of them that he didn't mention, are now undergoing criminal investigation for embezzling something like $2 million of American taxpayer dollars from the University of Denmark. Conclusions reached by the CD-funded foreign researchers defy rational thinking. Thimerosal is a known neurotoxin. It is dramatically neurotoxic. And if you can say that children that get more exposure to thimerosal are less likely to have neurological problems, then I would suggest there is something fundamentally wrong with the design of your study. And they have done this, I mean, in Denmark, in England, and in Sweden. They have said that removing thimerosal dramatically increased the rate of autism. Now, why do these countries not put thimerosal back in their vaccines if it is somewhat protective or dramatically protective, some of them shown? The CDC and other government health agencies have steadfastly refused to evaluate the rates of autism of Americans between an unvaccinated and vaccinated group of children. We need to do that. For example, the Amish have a very low rate of autism, and they do not vaccinate per the recommended CDC schedule. And I think this is something that has been avoided and avoided on purpose. Now, if we look at the autism risk, this is the 5 sequential studies done by the people he talked about that was funded by the CDC and headed by Estradiol. There were 5 presentations of this. They started out early on with a relative risk of 7.62, which indicates that thimerosal is causal for autism. This went down to, after the second report, to 2.48, then 169, and then study 4, which was presented at the Simpsonwood meeting, in which the CDC and many of the people that he mentions as being good at finding illnesses in autism. It was parents and other people who were concerned about thimerosal were excluded from this meeting. The meeting was held in secret, and they weren't allowed to get it out, and yet this was found by the Freedom of Information Act material, and it's on safeminds.com. And if you go there and you look at it, and what I would tell you is that there's no doubt what he presents, what Dr. Wile presents, is the way to do these studies. But you know, you can manipulate data, and when this got down to 1, it meant that it wasn't causal. It didn't protect, but it wasn't causal. They then published it, and then they lost all of the data, and so we can't check it whether it's out. Now this is a contrast to the research that was done, again funded by the CDC, with all the information from the emails that were selected. The Danes indicated that removing thimerosal from their data, this is a paper from Madsen, the colored material in there is stuff that I put in, that the rate of autism went up about 20-fold when they took thimerosal out. But if you look at the arrows I put in there, you see that they kind of gemmed the data up by adding outpatients, a large Copenhagen clinic, change the autism classification, and increase the number to go up. And while they were at the very highest, less than 5 per 10,000, the rate in the United States in that same time frame had gone from about 4 to 5 per 10,000 over 67, and now it's over 100 per 10,000. So when you look at this data, it reminds you of that old line that Mark Twain used from Disraeli. There are liars, damn liars, and statisticians. People can manipulate this data. And I will believe this data when it's turned over independently to an American university that is totally free of any vested interest. Now understand, the parents are saying that it was the CDC's mandated vaccine program that caused this problem. And all of the studies that we've seen that have been funded and pushed have been by the CDC. I don't know, I don't have my hands on the data. I don't get to see the numbers. But I can tell you that in 2003, there was still a lot of thimerosal and vaccines being given in the United States because the HMOs that were going and buying the vaccines, they had not outlawed the childhood thimerosal vaccines. They could still use them legally, and people could buy them and use them. And certainly, they had not removed it all from the market, because I've talked to a lot of parents that went to get their children vaccinated and found it even at these later days. So I would say that as far as the epidemiological studies that are going on, I think there's a lot of doubt. And until they do one on absolutely controlled children that have had no vaccines versus those that have had vaccines with thimerosal, I think this remains much an open issue, and I think there's absolutely no doubt about the culpability and the design to try and make these vaccines look safe. I mean, this Danish study by Madsen et al. And Hibbard, and actually Paul Thornton the Freedom of Information Act and the fact that they embezzled all this money from the U.S. taxpayer indicates that this is not data we can believe. And if we want this done, we need to be looking at vaccines from a totally different viewpoint. And I would say in the trombone data, Dr. Zabak has written an article on that. Trombone used data from 2 different cohort groups from 2 different cities, one to say how well they were vaccinated and another one to say who became ill. And I think that data has been shown not to be at all reliable and not to be well done and not to be honestly done as one would find from an epidemiological study. I would also point out that whenever you do the studies, for example, in England, the person who did that study, Elizabeth Miller, I believe, when you looked at it, if they said they started out with 7,000 children in their cohort group, and then they selected 4,000 for the study. So if you take out all of the preemies, all the children that are kind of ill, low body weight, etc., and exclude them from the vaccine study, and then look at only the healthy children, you indeed will come up with thimerosal maybe not having as big a problem, because it's obvious to all of us that thimerosal doesn't cause autism in every child. But when you do the study and you exclude the preemies and the children that are on antibiotics, and yet in the real world those children get thimerosal vaccines too, this could be the reason that you see an increase in such children. And when you look at their data, they do a lot of cherry picking of what children they include on their studies. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Haley. Dr. Wile, you have 8 minutes to respond when the presenter slide switches.
Okay. Oops. There we go. So first thing is, it is absolutely not true that autism is highest in the U.S. Compared to other countries. The Generation Rescue report that Dr. Boyd mentioned is fundamentally dishonest. All you have to do is look at the report to notice that some major players aren't listed. Australia, Canada, the UK, they all have autism rates that are roughly identical to the U.S., and they have significantly lower vaccines as well. Canada only has 20 childhood vaccines, whereas the U.S. has 31. Also, in Generation Rescue's report, where they did compare other countries to the U.S., they didn't compare them fairly because they didn't compare autism rates over the same time period. They used recent U.S. rates and old rates from the other countries. So, in fact, it is not true that autism is highest in the U.S. Also, it is not true that genetic diseases cannot change over time. They most certainly can. First of all, we know autism is mostly genetic. Twin studies show this. For example, the British twin study showed that 92% of identical twins shared autism spectrum disorders, but only 10% of fraternal twins. Since identical twins have the same DNA and fraternal twins don't, that tells you an enormous amount of autism is genetic. A 2007 review of several twin and family studies showed that the heritability of autism is 90%, indicating 90% of it is genetic. Also, it is absurd to say that genetic diseases can't increase over time. They most certainly can, because in the end, our germline, the cells that we use in reproduction, age with us and collect mutations. This has been very well known in a report published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, showing that as a man gets older, his sperm produce more mutations, and therefore his children will have more mutations in them. And in fact, one study examined 130,000 Jewish people, found that the fathers who were over 40 were 6 times more likely to have autistic children than fathers under 30. So in the end, if the average age of the parent changes over time, which we know it does, then the genetics change over time, and that can explain a lot of the increase in autism. Some of the studies he produced are very poor studies. For example, he talked about the Gallagher and Goodman study that supposedly showed that hepatitis B of vaccination of male neonates increases autism diagnosis. In fact, the problem with this study is the autism diagnosis was not based on medical records or examining the patient. It was based on reading a question to the mother that simply says, looking at this list, which contains autism, has a doctor or other professional ever told you that your child had any of these conditions? So this isn't even a reasonable way of determining whether someone is autistic. So if you start with bad data, you're going to produce a horrible conclusion. Another study he talked about on the hepatitis B vaccine, which was done by Gallagher, studied 1,824 children, which at first glance looks really good, but they made their conclusion on only 46 vaccinated boys and 7 unvaccinated boys. That produces enormous errors on the order of 38%. So such a study doesn't have much relevance because it's got a lot of error associated with it. And, okay, thank you. The merthiolate study he talked about and the study by Fagan, which got thimerosal removed from antibiotics, these were compounds in which the thimerosal dose was up to 200 times greater than what you get in vaccines. So it's not relevant. In the end, you have to look at studies that use the relevant dose for vaccination. Probably the worst study he talked about of all of them was the primate study. He claimed that the primate study showed that primates exposed to thimerosal had autism-like symptoms. In fact, here's what the data were. What they did was they looked at a particular part of the brain called the amygdala, and they looked at it at 2 times in 4 months and 6 months of development. What they showed was the 2 monkeys in their unvaccinated group. That's an error of 71%, 2 monkeys. The 2 monkeys in the unvaccinated group, their amygdalas shrank over that period. That's unhealthy. That's not what should happen to a developing infant monkey. What they showed was the vaccinated group, which had only like 9, so that's got high errors as well. They actually had the healthy amygdala growth. And you can see it's healthy by looking at a graph of amygdala volume over time for healthy max, which was done in a completely separate study, and that shows constant growth over the time. So in fact, the only thing that study showed was that their control group was poorly chosen. Also, he made an absurd figure saying that the thimerosal exposure in vaccines is only safe, according to the EPA, if the infant is 275 pounds. That's nonsense because the EPA figure is based on a per day, every day dose, not a one-time dose. The EPA says you can get a certain amount of mercury per day, every day, and still be healthy. That's not what happens with vaccines. You get a one-time dose. You can't compare a per day, every day dose to a one-time dose. Yeah, Dr. Boyd was trying to do that. That's just basic unit analysis, which cannot be done. And finally, it's not true that boys are doing worse on the SAT. Girls are doing better on the SAT, but only on the news section, the one that was just introduced, the essay section. You can see that on this ABC news report. It is true that girls are doing better on the SAT, but it's only on that news section, the one that was just introduced. The boys are still beating the girls on the other parts of the SAT. I don't know of any data that indicate boys are slipping academically relative to girls. In fact, I see the studies I see say exactly this, that they're staying roughly the same distance. Girls have always performed better on written tests than on multiple choice tests. Okay, so that's it. Should I send it back to Dr. Haley then?
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, sending it back
Dr. Haley.
Dr. Haley now.
All right, now we're going to have closing arguments from each side. Dr. Haley, you'll have 5 minutes for closing arguments when you are ready.
Okay, well, I would just point out that the concept of what we call the boy crisis wasn't invented by me. This is coming out of education, in which people are talking about boys lacking the ability to concentrate and make grades in high school, through college, etc. That's not a Boyd-Haley construction. That's from the Department of Education. With regard to the other issues with thimerosal, if we go down and we look at the abnormalities, of autism mimicked by thimerosal exposure. This is children with autism have mitochondrial dysfunction, and what we're going to see if you go through all of these studies that I have, these are published in refereed journals, and what they show is that
if I can,
we're not seeing
a second. Are you seeing your slide on?
Yes, I do.
Stuff that you are. We're not seeing those right now.
I'm gonna reboot. I'm passing it back to me and then passing it back to him. See if that fixes it. Okay, so Dr. Haley, can you center again?
Can you see it now?
No, we're still not seeing your slide.
I'm going to change it to myself real quick, and then I'm going to change it to Dr. Haley.
Okay, there's Nick.
Yeah.
And there may be a button you need to click to accept it.
Is it there?
There we go.
I mean,
there we go.
Okay. This is the study where a lot of people have gone through, because it does seem whenever they have autistic children that they find out they have a mitochondrial dysfunction. Even if they're identical twins, one with autism and one without, the one will have a mitochondrial dysfunction, which seems to be caused by, at the start, causes unknown. But what they have, if we go through this, we find out that there are studies in here that suggest that metabolic evaluation indicated that autistic parents and that defects of oxidative phosphorylation might be prevalent. Thimerosal is one of the molecules that does it. Here, thimerosal induces neuronal cell apoptosis, causing cytochrome C, and apoptosis-inducing. Apoptosis means programmed cell death released from mitochondria. So, and thimerosal does this at nanomolar concentrations, inducing neuronal cell death through the mitochondrial pathway. And so their data suggested that thimerosal causes apoptosis in neuroblastoma cells by changing the mitochondrial environment. Now, I want to make one comment when he talked about the fact that I said that the amount of mercury in a thimerosal-induced vaccination would be EPA safe on a daily basis if the child weighed 275 pounds. There's a big difference between taking a shot of whiskey every day of the week and then chugging the whole beer. The point that I was making in that article is that these children were given a bolus, massive dose of thimerosal on day one, and that's how toxins really work. Toxins are not so likely to get you given a small amount at a time when your body has the protection to sequester it and say chelate the mercury that's involved and get rid of it. But when you overwhelm the system with a bolus amount, such as they did, then you have to consider the danger, and then you also have to consider the danger that it was injected directly into the body and not taken through the intestine. I don't think there's anything exaggerated about what I'm saying about that. And here's another study that shows mitochondria-mediated thimerosal-induced apoptosis in human neuroblastoma cell line, and it talks about the deleterious effect of the cytosol architecture of mitochondria by thimerosal, which can be long-lasting. In other words, you can damage the cytostructure of these mitochondria, and they survive in the body for a period of time. Again, the sensitization effect of thimerosal is mediated by reactive oxygen species and calcium signal. Now, this is what really becomes important and what I think that the audience needs to understand. Oxidative stress. Autistic children, almost all of them, suffer from oxidative stress. This means low glutathione levels. Low glutathione levels means that you do not have the ability to fight off any attack by any heavy metal. And infants are known to have low glutathione levels relative to adults. So what they're seeing in some of the data we're looking at is that these data suggest that thimerosal induces oxidative stress in mitochondria and causes mitochondrial membrane problems of that and calcium signal systems. This is fitting into identifying the biochemistry that you see in these autistic children, and it concentrates and it focuses on what might be causing that. Now, the other serious thing is that we have a paper here from the University of California, UCLA, and what they've found in the last few years is that mercury exposure detectable in the blood of American women in 1999 and 2000 was about 2%. And today, in 2005 and 2006, in the NHANES study, the National Health and the National Health and Nutritional Evaluation Study, is that it went up to 30%. So we're seeing a huge increase in mercury in American people. And this means that any other addiction, such as from vaccines or other exposures, could increase the level of mercury in these children. Bottom line is, we have to explain, and I would like to have Dr. Wile address it, how do you explain our increased death, our infant death rate in the United States? What are we doing that causes our children to die more? Our children are definitely more ill. How do you explain the CDC saying that 1 out of 6 American children has a neurodevelopmental problem? And to say that it's caused by genetics, that cannot possibly be true. Genetics has never, ever caused an epidemic. Not in 10-year period or 20-year period. Genetics cannot cause an epidemic. That's general biology. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haley. For our final speech this evening, we have Dr. Wile for a closing argument not to exceed 5 minutes.
Okay, well, you asked me what's causing the death rates. It's right there. Anybody can find it. It's birth defects, preterm birth, low weight, sudden infant death syndrome, maternal complications, complications of the umbilical cord. None of this has anything to do with autism. In fact, none of this has anything to do with vaccines. In fact, we now know that the DPT vaccine protects against sudden infant death syndrome. Vaccinated kids that are vaccinated with DPT vaccine are up to 6 times less likely to have SIDS. So, in fact, we know what's causing the infant death rates, and it has nothing to do with vaccines. I do want to...
Pardon me, isn't infant death syndrome, no one knows what causes that?
Well, we know that 50% of those cases are tied to a bacterial infection that is protected against the DPT. And if you do the study, you find that those who get the DPT vaccine are 6 times less likely to die of SIDS than those who do not get the DPT vaccine. And in fact, there's a paper published just 2 years ago, or just a few years ago on that, explaining the biochemistry as to why this is the case.
Dr. Haley, we have just 5 minutes for the.
If it doesn't take away from my time, I can show him the actual reference if he gives me a second. But I can't let this take away from my time. But this is a very well-known study to anybody who looks at vaccines at all. It's surprising you don't know this study because it's, like I said, incredibly well-known. It's sudden infant death syndrome, and so the study is from Walker in 1987, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, immunization, sudden infant death syndrome. Shows the protective effect. Esri in 1999 showed the biochemistry of why that is the case.
Does that answer your question, Dr. Hayden?
I mean, I've talked to a lot of people. I've had no one tell me that they think that the mystery of sudden infant death syndrome has been resolved.
I'm not saying it's been resolved. I'm saying the epidemiology shows that the DPT vaccine is protective, and since sudden infant death syndrome is linked to a bacterial infection in 50% of the cases, the biochemistry is clear about why, because the DPT vaccine increases IgG immunoglobulins.
All right, Dr. Wile, I'm going to start your time again and back to your closing remarks.
Let me correct another mistake Dr. Haley made. Dr. Haley made. Wow, sorry about that. First of all, the Amish most certainly do vaccinate. They follow the CDC schedule very closely. Yoder and Dworkin showed in 2006 that 84% of the old order Amish households vaccinate all of their children. I mean, they go to school, so most of them do vaccinate. Dr. Kevin Strauss, who works with autism with the Amish, says, quote, "The idea that the Amish do not vaccinate the children is untrue. We run a weekly vaccination clinic, and it is very busy. They also do have autism. That's not something that anybody who knows about autism would say because it's simply not true." I want to point out here that I gave a lot of studies, and the only thing that Dr. Haley could say against those studies was he made some smear attacks on the people who did the studies. He couldn't talk about methodology. He couldn't talk about what was wrong with the studies. All he could do was talk about people embezzling money and how they can't be trusted. But the fact is, the first 3 studies I showed were done by people who have already shown that they find problems with vaccines. They have a proven track record of getting a vaccine off the vaccination schedule when it is dangerous. They've proven that. They clearly don't have nefarious motives. They've done it before. They would do it again if these studies showed that thimerosal was related to autism. The other thing I would say about that is he's saying that you can cherry pick data and things like that. For that Quebec study that I showed, there was no cherry picking. The raw data simply said thimerosal-exposed children were more likely to be autistic. It was once you started massaging the data and clearing up confounders that the association went away. So you're not cherry-picking data when you just look at the non-thimerosal-exposed infants and see they have a higher rate of autism. Now, you say that sounds crazy. It sounds crazy only if you accept the idea that thimerosal causes autism, in spite of the fact that all the serious studies show that it does not. And I would also say this, the last thing you talked about, Dr. Haley, was that the study that showed that from 1999 to, I believe, 2006, the level of mercury in the blood went up. That could very well be true. I'm not familiar with that study, but that once again points against thimerosal, because since 2001, the level of thimerosal exposure to kids has gone down significantly. Now, you're right. You could find an odd vaccine here or there that still had thimerosal in it. I'm not disputing that at all. But the fact is, since 2001, not a new vaccine has been manufactured, except for the flu vaccines, with any more than just a trace amount of thimerosal. And so the thimerosal exposure has gone down significantly. If mercury in the blood is still going up, that is once again shows that it's not thimerosal that's the culprit, because thimerosal exposure has been going down since 2001. So the data really speak against this idea here. In the end, you cannot use any study to link thimerosal to autism in people. No study does that with any reliable results. Okay, that's it. Should I give the presenter back to Nick? I'm giving it back to Nick.
Yes, that sounds good. Well, thank you both for speaking this evening. I think it was a really great debate. This debate was sponsored by the International Medical Council on Vaccination at www.vaccinationcouncil.org and the Home First Farm Store at www.homefirst.com. Thank you again, Dr. Boyd Haley and Dr. J. Wile, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay, should I stop recording at this point? Or is there more?
Yeah, please do.